Miss Brent looked like nothing so much as an aged hawk in whom the lust to prey still lingered, without the power of making the physical effort to capture it. "Patricia," she demanded, "what is all this I hear?" "If you've been talking to Miss Wangle and Mrs. Mosscrop Smythe, Aunt Adelaide, heaven only knows what you've heard," replied Patricia calmly. "Patricia!" Miss Brent invariably began her remarks by uttering the name of the person whom she addressed. "Patricia, you know perfectly well what I mean." "I should know better if you would tell me," murmured Patricia with a patient sigh as she seated herself in the easiest of the uneasy chairs, and proceeded to pull off her gloves. "Patricia, I refer to these stories about your being engaged." "Yes, Aunt Adelaide?" "Have you nothing to say?" "Nothing in particular. People get engaged, you know. I suppose it is because they've got nothing else to do." "Patricia, don't be frivolous." "Frivolous? Me frivolous? Aunt Adelaide, if you were secretary to a brainless politician, who is supposed to rise, but who won't rise, can't rise, and never will rise, from 10 until 5 each day, for the magnificent salary of 2½ guineas a week, even you wouldn't be able to be frivolous." "Patricia!" There was surprised disapproval in Miss Brent's voice. "Are you mad?" "No, Aunt Adelaide, just bored stiff." Patricia emphasized the word stiff in a way that brought Miss Brent into an even more upright position. "Patricia, I wish you would change your idiom. Your flagrant vulgarity would have deeply pained your poor dear father." Patricia made no response. She simply looked as she felt, unutterably bored. She was incapable even of invention. Supposing she told her aunt the whole story, at least she would have the joy of seeing the look of horror that would overspread her features. "Patricia," continued Miss Brent, "I repeat, what is this I hear about your being engaged?" "Oh," replied Patricia indifferently, "I suppose you've heard the truth. I've got engaged." "Without telling me a word about it?" "Oh, well, those are nasty things, you know, that one doesn't advertise." "Patricia!" "Well, aunt, you say that all men are beasts, and if you associate with beasts, you don't like the world to know about it." "Patricia!" repeated Miss Brent. "Aunt Adelaide!" cried Patricia, "you make me feel that I absolutely hate my name. I wish I'd been numbered. If you say Patricia again, I shall scream. Is it true that you are engaged to Lord Peter Bowen?" "Good Lord, no!" Patricia sat up in astonishment. "Then that woman in the lounge is a liar." There was uncompromising conviction in Miss Brent's tone. Patricia leaned forward and smiled. "Aunt Adelaide, you are singularly discriminating today. She is a liar, and she also happens to be a cat." Miss Brent appeared not to hear Patricia's remark. She was occupied with her own thoughts. She possessed a masculine habit of thinking before she spoke, and in consequence she was as devoid of impulse and spontaneity as a snail. Patricia watched her aunt covertly, her mind working furiously. What could it mean? Lord Peter Bowen? Miss Wangle was not given to making mistakes in which the aristocracy were concerned. At Galvin House she was the recognized authority upon anything and everything concerned with royalty and the titled and landed gentry. County families were her hobbies, and the peerage her obsession. It would be just like Peter, thought Patricia, to turn out a lord, just the ridiculous, inconsequent sort of thing he would delight in. She was unconscious of any incongruity in thinking of him as Peter. It seemed the natural thing to do. She saw by the signs on her aunt's face that she was nearing a decision. Conscious that she must not burn her boats, Patricia burst in upon Miss Brent's thoughts with a suddenness that startled her. "If Miss Wangle desires to discuss my friends with you in future, Aunt Adelaide, I think she should adopt the names by which they prefer to be known." Patricia watched the surprised look upon her aunt's face, and with dignity met the keen hawk-like glance that flashed from her eyes. "If, for reasons of his own," continued Patricia, "a man chooses to drop his title in favour of his rank in the army, that, I think, is a matter for him to decide, and not one that requires discussion at Miss Wangle's hands." Miss Brent's stare convinced Patricia that she was carrying things off rather well. "Patricia, where did you meet this Colonel Peter Bowen?" The question came like a thunderclap to Patricia's unprepared ears. All her self-complacency of a moment before now deserted her. She felt her face crimsoning. How she envied girls who did not blush. What on earth could she tell her aunt? Why had an undiscriminating Providence given her an Aunt Adelaide at all? Why had it not bestowed this inestimable treasure upon someone more deserving? What could she say? As well think of lying to Rhadamanthus as to Miss Brent. Then Patricia had an inspiration. She would tell her aunt the truth, trusting to her not to believe it. "Where did I meet him, Aunt Adelaide?" she remarked indifferently. "Oh, I picked him up in a restaurant. He looked nice." "Patricia! How dare you say such a thing before me?" A slight flush mantled Miss Brent's sallow cheeks. All the proprieties, all the chastities, and all the moralities banked up behind her in moral support. "You ought to feel ashamed of yourself, Patricia. London has done you no good. What would your poor dear father have said?" "I'm sorry, Aunt Adelaide, but please remember I've had a very tiring week, trying to leaven an unleavenable politician. Shall we drop the subject of Colonel Bowen for the time being?" "Certainly not," snapped Miss Brent. "It is my duty as your sole surviving relative." How Patricia deplored that word surviving. Why had her Aunt Adelaide survived? "As your sole surviving relative," repeated Miss Brent, "it is my duty to look after your welfare." "But," protested Patricia, "I'm nearly 25, and I'm quite able to look after myself." "Patricia, it is my duty to look after you." Miss Brent spoke as if she were about to walk over heated ploughshares rather than to satisfy a natural curiosity. "I repeat," proceeded Miss Brent, "where did you meet Colonel Bowen?" "I have told you, Aunt Adelaide, but you won't believe me." "I want to know the truth, Patricia. Is he really Lord Peter?" persisted Miss Brent. "To be quite candid, I have never asked him," replied Patricia. Miss Brent stared at her niece. The obviously feminine thing was to express surprise, but Miss Brent never did the obvious thing. Instead of repeating, "Never asked him," she remained silent for some moments, while Patricia, with great intentness, proceeded to jerk her gloves into shape. "Patricia, you're mad!" Miss Brent spoke with conviction. Patricia glanced up from her occupation and smiled at her aunt as if entirely sharing her conviction. "It's the price of spinsterhood with some women," was all she said. Miss Brent glared at her, but there was more than a spice of curiosity in her look. "Then you decline to tell me?" she inquired. There was in her voice a note that told of a mind made up. Patricia knew from past experience that her aunt had made up her mind as to her course of action. "Tell you what?" she inquired innocently. "Whether or no the Colonel Bowen you're engaged to is Lord Peter Bowen." Patricia determined to temporize in order to gain time. She knew Aunt Adelaide to be capable of anything, even to calling upon Lord Peter Bowen's family and inquiring if it were he to whom her niece was engaged. She was too bewildered to know how to act. It would be so like this absurd person to turn out to be a lord and make her still more ridiculous. If he were Lord Peter, why on earth had he not told her? Had he thought she would be dazzled? Suddenly there flashed into Patricia's mind an explanation which caused her cheeks to flame and her eyes to flash. She strove to put the idea aside as unworthy of him, but it refused to leave her. She had heard of men giving false names to girls they met, in the way she and Bowen had met. He had then, in spite of his protestations, mistaken her. In all probability he was not staying at the Quadrant at all. What a fool she had been! She had told all about herself, whereas he had told her nothing beyond the fact that his name was Peter Bowen. Oh, it was intolerable, humiliating. The worst of it was that she seemed unable to extricate herself from the ever-increasing tangle arising out of her folly. Miss Wangle and Galvin House had been sufficiently serious factors, requiring all her watchfulness to circumvent them. But now Aunt Adelaide had thrown herself precipitately into the melee, and heaven alone knew what would be the outcome. Had her aunt been a man, or merely a woman, Patricia argued, she would not have been so dangerous. But she possessed the deliberate logic of the one and the quickness of perception of the other. With her feminine eye she could see, and with her manlike brain she could judge.